He leaves a note for police at the scene of the murder. Not a mistake, not something he panicked and forgot. A deliberate message, written in his own hand, daring them to catch him. "I am leaving this crime with one clue," it reads. "Find it yourself. Die, pig." What he doesn't know, what he can't possibly know, standing in that ransacked apartment in 1978, is that he already has left the clue, not the note, something far more permanent: fingerprints, pressed into a bathroom sink where he stopped to wash a dead man's blood off his own hands before driving away in the dead man's car. He's not being careless, he's being arrogant. In 1978, there is no system on Earth capable of taking a fingerprint left at a crime scene and searching it against millions of others in a matter of hours. That technology doesn't exist yet. It won't exist for another 30 years. And so the man who taunted police with a note, confident they'd never catch him, is actually right. For 3 decades, he's untouchable. Not because he's clever, but because science simply hasn't caught up to the mistake he already made. This is the story of Carroll Bonnet and the killer who mocked an entire police department using evidence he'd already left behind, without knowing that evidence would eventually be the exact thing that convicted him. If you're the kind of person who needs to know how a case like this finally gets solved, subscribe now, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Omaha, Nebraska, in the fall of 1978, was an unremarkable working city, the kind of place where people went to their jobs, came home, and trusted the ordinary rhythms of daily life without much reason to think twice about it. Carroll Bonnet fit neatly into that rhythm. 61 years old, an employee at Clarkson Hospital, the kind of steady job that fills a working life without ever making headlines. He lived alone. He kept a tidy apartment. He wasn't the kind of man anyone expected to end up at the center of a murder investigation, let alone one that would take 3 decades to close. On October 17, 1978, Bonnet hadn't shown up for work in 2 days. For a man known for reliability, that alone raised alarm. His apartment manager, worried enough to check on him personally, went to the unit and looked through the window. What he saw stopped him cold. Bonnet was lying face down on the living room floor, naked, completely still. Firefighters broke in, expecting a medical emergency. What they found instead was a murder scene. Bonnet was already dead, killed by a single stab wound to his torso. The apartment, normally kept tidy, by every account, had been torn apart, furniture disturbed, the whole space searched or fought through, or both. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere, which told investigators something important immediately. Bonnet had likely let his killer in himself. This wasn't a stranger breaking through a window in the night. It was someone he'd opened his own door for. And there, somewhere in that wrecked apartment, was the note, left deliberately, written directly to whoever would eventually be assigned to catch him. It wasn't just a murder, it was a challenge. Crime scene technicians got to work, empty beer cans, towels apparently used to clean up, and, critically, latent fingerprints and palm prints lifted from Bonnet's own bathroom. Investigators believed the killer had gone in there specifically to scrub blood off his hands and body before driving off in Bonnet's car, an attempt at covering his tracks that, ironically, left behind exactly the kind of evidence that should have identified him almost immediately. Bonnet's car itself was gone. Shortly after, it turned up more than 500 miles away, in Cicero, Illinois, fitted with a stolen Illinois plate, a detail suggesting more premeditation than a simple burglary gone wrong. More prints were lifted from inside it. Investigators now had 2 separate sets of physical evidence from 2 separate locations, both pointing at the same unknown man. For a case with this much to work with, detectives in 1978 had every reason to expect it would close within weeks. They ran the prints against every local and state file available. They sent requests to agencies outside Nebraska, and they got back exactly nothing, no match, anywhere, for a set of prints that unquestionably belonged to Carroll Bonnet's killer. Here's the part that's almost impossible to sit with once you understand it. Those prints were good, clear, usable. They simply had nowhere to go, because in 1978, there was no automated system on Earth capable of comparing a single fingerprint against millions of records in hours. Matching prints meant physically checking them, file by file, against whatever a detective could get his hands on locally, a process bound entirely by geography and luck. Without a name to attach to that evidence, the case went cold. Not because anyone stopped trying, because they'd run out of tools. For the next 30 years, Carroll Bonnet's file sat exactly like that. A taunting note, a perfect set of fingerprints, a stolen car recovered hundreds of miles away, and no way to turn any of it into a suspect. Detectives who worked it in 1978 eventually moved on, retired, left the department, the way careers do over 3 decades, while the answer to who killed Carroll Bonnet sat completely intact in an evidence room, waiting for a piece of technology nobody involved could have possibly imagined yet. That technology finally arrived in the form of EAFIS, the FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system, a searchable database holding records for tens of millions of people, capable of comparing a single latent print against that entire database in hours instead of decades. In late 2008, a routine inquiry landed on the Omaha Police Department's cold case desk about the still unsolved Bonnet file. It reached a crime laboratory technician named Laura Casey, and Casey made a decision that would end 30 years of silence. She pulled the original 1978 latent prints out of storage, prints that hadn't been touched by anyone in 3 decades, and submitted them to EAFIS for the very first time. The system had never seen these prints before. Nobody knew if there would even be anything to compare them against. Casey submitted the search and waited. In less than 5 hours, EAFIS came back with a list of possible candidates. It wasn't over yet. A computer match isn't proof, it's a starting point. Technicians spent days afterward doing the painstaking manual work of comparing ridge patterns and matching points by eye, one candidate at a time, against the decades-old prints from that bathroom sink. Every wrong candidate eliminated brought them one name closer. And then, finally, a positive identification. The prints belonged to a man named Jerry Watson. Investigators located him without much difficulty, because unlike so many cold case suspects who spend decades building new identities, Watson wasn't hiding. He was already incarcerated, serving time at the Lawrence Correctional Center in Illinois on unrelated burglary charges. An ordinary criminal, serving an ordinary sentence, with no idea a 30-year-old murder case had just quietly attached itself to his name. Once his identity was confirmed, the pieces that had sat frozen for 3 decades suddenly started moving. Investigators discovered Watson had grown up in Cicero, Illinois, just blocks from where Bonnet's stolen car had been abandoned back in 1978. And records showed something even more damning. Watson had a relative living in Omaha, and he'd visited that relative in the fall of 1978 in a location close enough to Bonnet's own apartment that the geography stopped looking like coincidence entirely. A killer whose prints matched the scene. A stolen car found near his hometown. A confirmed visit to Omaha at exactly the right moment. On November 15, 2010, 32 years after Carroll Bonnet's body was found on his own living room floor, Jerry Watson was formally charged with first-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony. Here's what makes this case genuinely different from almost every other cold case that eventually gets solved. There was no confession, no witness stepping forward after decades of silence, no suspect's carelessness catching up with him. The entire case rested on a piece of physical evidence that had been sitting correctly labeled, perfectly preserved, and completely useless for 30 years, waiting only for the invention of a machine capable of finally reading it. If cases like that, solved purely by science catching up to old evidence, are what keep you coming back to this channel, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of exactly that kind of story still to come. The trial carried a complication almost no other murder case has to face. By August 2011, 33 years had passed since the murder, an extraordinary length of time for any case, let alone one going in front of a jury weighing evidence from a crime scene most of them hadn't even been alive to see. Many of the original 1978 witnesses were dead or impossible to locate. Watson's defense argued this delay had denied him his right to properly confront witnesses and mount a full defense. That time itself had quietly become part of the prosecution's advantage. The trial ran 10 days. Day by day, prosecutors rebuilt a 33-year-old night for the jury, piece by piece. The fingerprints, the stolen car, the visit to Omaha that placed Watson exactly where he shouldn't have been. An Omaha firefighter who had been part of the original 1978 rescue squad took the stand, one of the very few people left alive who could describe firsthand exactly what that apartment had looked like the day Bonnet's body was found. Each day of testimony added another layer the defense had to explain away, and with each layer, the explanation got harder to believe. The jury went into deliberation, carrying fingerprint evidence lifted from a bathroom over 3 decades earlier. A stolen car matched to a killer's own hometown. A documented visit to Omaha at precisely the wrong moment. On August 25, 2011, 33 years, almost to the week, after Carroll Bonnet's body was discovered, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty, first-degree murder. Guilty on the additional charge of using a deadly weapon to commit a felony. Then came a detail that feels almost too precise to be anything but deliberate irony. On October 17, 2011, exactly 33 years to the day since Bonnet's body had been found on his living room floor, Jerry Watson stood before a judge and was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 10 to 20 years on the weapons charge. Carroll Bonnet would have turned 91 that same year. Watson didn't accept it quietly. He appealed all the way to the Nebraska Supreme Court, arguing the 33-year gap had unfairly deprived him of witnesses who might have helped his defense, and that the evidence simply wasn't sufficient to convict him. In 2013, the court rejected every part of it, affirming the conviction in full, ruling that Watson couldn't prove prosecutors had deliberately delayed charges to gain an advantage, and that the fingerprint evidence alone gave a jury more than enough to convict. He later sought post-conviction relief as well. That, too, was denied. To this day, the full motive behind Carroll Bonnet's murder has never been stated in complete detail. Investigators and prosecutors have pointed to robbery, Watson wanting Bonnet's car badly enough to kill for it, a theory reinforced by the vehicle being stolen and later found near Watson's own hometown. But whether it started as a robbery that spiraled into violence, or something else entirely lost to 33 years of distance, Watson never gave investigators the full account. The fingerprints told police who did it. They never told anyone why. Carroll Bonnet spent his life the way most people do, showing up, working steadily, keeping a tidy home, the kind of quiet consistency that rarely makes headlines and rarely gets remembered by history once it's gone. He never got to see any of this. Never got to see the note his killer left behind get repaid 3 decades later by the exact evidence that killer thought would never catch up to him. He mocked the police who came looking for him. He left them a note bragging that they'd never find the clue that mattered. He was already wrong the moment he wrote it. If you believe cases like this deserve to be remembered, the ones solved not by a killer's mistake in the moment, but by science finally catching up to evidence that was right all along, subscribe to see which case gets uncovered next.